All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our specially called Planning Economic Community Services meeting. I'm the chair, Commissioner Johnson. I'm joined by Commissioner Rita Davis Johnson and Commissioner Jeff Rader. It just came on board. He is here. And so we have our committee. We're going to embark on the next couple of months, a very crucial issue that's very important, that's been important for, I guess, the beginning of time in terms of shelter and housing for everyone. But right now, at this moment, we are facing some crucial questions and decisions we have to make around an issue that's vital to all of us, which is called housing. And what I'm going to do as the chair is take us through a number of exercises that I'm called framing the housing discussion. And what we're going to do is bring on experts who have a direct impact, who understands it, who eats it, who lives it, who sleeps it, to help us guide us as a body on creating some sound public policy around housing for not only the 21st century, but the 22nd and beyond. Because as a county, we are 200 years old. And you can imagine coming from an agrarian society to a suburban environment to now an urban environment, what we've done through those years as a county has changed. Well, you went from big farms to then going to suburbia with big yards, and now you're moving to urban where you're looking at townhomes, cottages in smaller places because it is more expensive. And so I'm glad to have our committee members on board. And I see Commissioner Bradshaw. Thank you, good sir. But that's part of our conversation and what we're going to do. And so we're not going to rush. We're going to take our time. We're going to educate. We're going to engage. We're going to bring as many folks into the fold as possible. And at the end of this exercise, my hope is that the committee can come up with a few legislative items that we can give to our federal and state partners that can help us locally in order for us to deal with this housing issue. And so thank you all that's on board today. The first part of the discussion, committee members will be us talking with our Dr. Rich and Mr. Mitchell, who commissioned through our CEO office the housing study update. And then the second half of our meeting will be to talk to some of our housing experts. We're going to have DeKalb Housing on board with Mr. Walker, as well as Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership with a former commissioner, who's the director of ANDP, Mr. John Callahan. And then our second meeting in September, we're going to hear from some of our federal partners and state partners from ACCG, NACO, National Association of Counties. We're going to hear from some other housing experts hopefully from Georgia State. Dr. Emma Glock will be on board. And from there, we'll go on to looking at some of the local housing authorities in the cities and hear some best practices. So we got a roadmap that is planned out that we can use for us to have critical and crucial conversations around housing. And so we will move forward. I'm joined by Commissioner Ted Terry and Commissioner Cochran Johnson as well. So I want to turn it over to you, Mr. Mitchell, because you will help us in the first part of the discussion. And what we'll do is our committee members will have him come on. He'll talk for a couple of minutes, and Dr. Rich, and we'll open up for some questions. And then the second half of the conversation will be from the DeKalb Housing Authority and ANDP. So take it away, Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon to all. We're happy to be here. We, by way of introduction, we've worked over the years on obviously affordable housing.
Oh, one second, Mr. Mitchell. I got one little article I want to bring up right quick because I want people to understand the magnitude of the issue is more than just county government. It involves our partners. And this was an article I saw today in the AJC. Some Georgians are facing housing voucher shortage. And what it talked about won't rent to them. Could you go down for the article so I can make sure we have it? And I think it's a great article because it sums up a part of what we're trying to focus on in our community. And the third paragraph said, Georgia residents whose income is low enough who low enough and of those who are elderly and disabled may qualify for rental assistance through several programs run by the state and federal government. The programs are subsidized in part for their rent, otherwise known as a voucher. Renters then shop for an apartment they can afford and pay the difference between the actual rent charged by the landlord and the amount subsidized by the program. Go up a little bit more. And so then they talked about the Department of Community Affairs estimate 970 households in Georgia have a commitment from the federal government through Georgia Housing Voucher Program to pay their rent, but they can't find housing. Another program run through the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Development of Disabilities has about 350 people with vouchers who actively searching for housing. And because those are just two of the major programs run through those departments, the number of voucher holders who can't find housing in Georgia is likely even higher based on program officials. And this is part of what we're talking about. We need our federal and state partners who provide the subsidies for just one part, which is affordable housing. And this housing discussion we're going to have over the next couple of months is more than just rental. We want to make sure people who want to have a house can get a house. It's about ownership as well. So this discussion will be broad and deep. And so I wanted to highlight that, and we'll send that article around to the commissioner so you can have it. But it just highlight, you can have the best program in the world, but and I think they had something about how the city of Atlanta passed an ordinance which said landlords have to rent. But if the state of Georgia does not mandate that based on income, the ordinance is for naught. And that's why I don't want us to create ordinances that feels good and that sounds good, but doesn't have impact. And so that's what we will do as we move forward in this discussion around housing. So take it away, Mr. Mitchell and Dr. Rich.
Thank you again, Commissioner. We're gathered here this afternoon to share with you the results of an update to a study that the Community Development Department had commissioned Emory University to perform in 2018. Here in 2022, Dr. Rich has agreed to update the study he did years ago, which was, we're impressed with it. And he's put a slide deck together. It's a fairly comprehensive report, but today is a slide deck that takes you to the high-level views of the report, as well as recommendations toward the bitter end. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Rich from Emory, a good friend and a fellow who's helped us out immensely over the years. Dr. Rich, would you start your presentation to share with the commissioners?
Certainly. Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everyone. Just bring my slides up here. So as Alan mentioned, this was an update to a study we had done a couple of years ago. And in doing this update, our areas of focus were looking at the current housing context, examining the policy responses in DeKalb and benchmarking them to other comparable urban counties in the Southeast, which we had done earlier as well, updating that analysis. Looking for innovative state and local practices that we might consider here, and offering some recommendations for DeKalb County officials and other stakeholders with interest in the issue of affordable housing. For this updated report, we looked at several recently completed studies on affordable and workforce housing in DeKalb, looked at some national studies and reports on affordable housing, and worked with a variety of different data sources that are available, including some proprietary data sources that enabled us to get a little deeper understanding of the current home and renter markets here in DeKalb. The report covered 6 areas. They're up here on the screen. We looked open with the national and metropolitan context, drilled down to look at Metro Atlanta, and then honed in on DeKalb, and looking therefore after that at assisted housing in large urban counties, and looking at the housing strategies that these comparison counties were working with, and then ended with a set of recommendations. I think it's important at the outset that we all understand that the housing issue with affordable housing has been with us for a long time. It's a very complicated issue. There are multiple facets to it. There's no single solution that we can look at. I note in the introduction to the report that there are at least 6 different dimensions that we need to be attentive to when we talk about affordable housing. Are we talking about owner housing, renter housing, vacant housing, some combination? What sectors need to be engaged in the design and implementation of the policy response? It's not simply things that the county can do. How can the county work in partnership with other levels of government as well as the private and nonprofit sectors? What intensity of treatment are we looking at? What policy tools are we going to mobilize? An important question is, what target population do we want to focus on? Affordable to whom? What income level? Are we talking about elderly populations, special need populations, and the like? And geography, what geographic areas might we look at? So if you take those 6 dimensions and look at the different elements of each of those dimensions, that probably yields about 36,000 different things that could be done to tackle affordable housing. That's far more than any one individual or organization or government can contemplate at any one particular point in time. The challenge is, how do we come up with a coherent strategy that brings together multiple different types of responses that collectively will help improve the status of housing in our area. So I'm going to briefly run through some of the slides from the report. There's a lot of data and charts. I don't want your eyes to glaze over too much, but I want to kind of set the context so that we can spend most of our time this afternoon focusing on the recommendations. So looking at recent trends in metropolitan Atlanta, we looked at population and population change. Here, the key thing to note is most of the 5 core counties in Atlanta had double-digit population increases between 2010 and 2020. Not quite as robust as the 90s and the 2000s, but an improvement over the previous decade. Employment change coming out of the recession. The most notable growth has been in Fulton County. Employment's up about 23% over 2010 compared to 2019. And the other core counties have been relatively flat. In DeKalb, based on county business pattern data, employment was up about 15% between 2010 and 2019. Although overall, the share of population and employment in DeKalb among just the 5 core counties has been declining, not quite as sharply as it was earlier, but it's kind of been flat over the last decade. Perhaps the most notable aspect is the growing diversification of the metro area. Here we're just looking at the 5 core counties and looking at race and ethnicity. Certainly if we look back to 1980 and we look today to 2020, the composition of all 5 core counties is dramatically more diverse than was the case 40 years ago. That diversity shows up not just in the overall numbers, but in the spatial distribution of populations across the 5 core counties. But overall, despite the demographic and economic transformation within metropolitan Atlanta, there still are large racial and class disparities, and they're often deeply rooted in the geography of the region. And the level of residential segregation remains high, particularly in the core counties of Fulton and DeKalb. And that in turn has important implications for the types of neighborhoods people can live in and the access to opportunities that those neighborhoods provide. Overall, if we take a longer term horizon, looking at a measure like the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, we see that Atlanta, represented by this dark red line here, did not have the big bump up that many other metro areas experienced in the late 2000s. But Atlanta came out of it a little bit later than the other metro areas, and since then has pretty much followed a similar trajectory as other major metros that are included in the core logic tracking. Looking more recently within the region, looking at median home sales price, we see that since 2008, the home sale prices in DeKalb have followed similar trends to the other 5 core counties, represented by the line graph on the left. And here's a map by zip code showing the percent change in median home sale prices from 2010 to 2021. The sharpest increases in DeKalb have been in the Belvedere Park, Handler, McAfee area over this time period. But if we look at the overall sales price, well, this had the Belvedere Park, Handler had the largest percentage increases. It's still at a relatively low median home sales price compared to other parts of the region, though that increase was pretty substantial. Turning to rents, here's data from a proprietary source, apartmentdata.com, that's looking at the average rent by bedroom size and class over the last 6 or so years. Monthly rents rose sharply across all bedroom sizes in 2021. Rents were up about 20%, which was about 4 to 5 times higher than what the annual average increase in rents had been during the period 2015 to 2020. And that kind of leads into one of the main takeaways from the study, and that is the predominant housing problem that we're seeing in Metro Atlanta and DeKalb in particular is the rise in the number of households that are cost burdened. That's a measure used by the census, and HUD, and other agencies to denote households that are paying 30% or more of their income for housing. So let's drill down now and look particularly at housing needs and challenges in DeKalb County. As I mentioned, the report was benchmarking DeKalb to not only the other 4 counties in the core of Metro Atlanta, but we also looked at 6 counties comparable to DeKalb across a variety of social, economic, and demographic indicators. Jefferson County outside Birmingham, Polk County in the Tampa area, Volusia County, Florida, Orlando, Anne Arundel County in Baltimore, Prince George's County in Washington, D.C., and Fort Bend in Houston. And these are just the overall, some of the demographic characteristics. We'll get to those comparisons in a bit. If we look now at housing tenure, the map on the left is showing owner-occupied housing. The one on the right, renter-occupied housing. This is data from the American Community Survey 5-year estimates, 2015-2019. We see that owner-occupied housing is largely concentrated in the northern sections of the county and the census tracts that border Gwinnett, whereas renter-occupied housing is mostly concentrated along the Buford Highway corridor and in central DeKalb. The important trend to emphasize is the changing composition of the rental stock in DeKalb County. And this is a pattern that we're seeing in other counties in the region and across the country. The fastest growing segment of the DeKalb rental stock is single family homes, which now account for almost 1 out of every 3 rental units. If we look back to 2010 and compare that with 2019 based on the American Community Survey data, you see the sharp increase in the number of single family units in the rental market and declines in small apartment buildings, those roughly between 2 and 20 units. The other, so that's one important factor. The other is the shifting in income composition of the apartments that are at rent, losing a substantial number of units that are renting at $1,000 or less, with most of the units that have been added being at the higher end of the market. So as I mentioned earlier, the cost burden is a predominant housing problem that we see in DeKalb and certainly across all the other comparison counties. And renter-occupied households are much more likely to be cost burdened than owner-occupied households, which we see here.
What does physical mean?
These are the types of housing problems that people are reporting. So a physical would mean there's a concern about the quality of the housing stock. Maybe the roof leaks, the windows are drafty, there are issues with the plumbing or the electrical or whatever. And then cost burden would be the other type of housing problem where people are paying more than 30% of their income for rent. And the blue bar represents physical problems, and you can see that they're a little bit more prevalent in the renter stock than the owner stock, but in both types of housing, not that they're non-existent, they're just far less frequent than what we see in terms of people reporting a housing problem related to cost.
And these are reported by the occupants based upon this survey methodology, right?
Correct.
Right, thanks.
As we take a little, collapse this a little bit and look at some of the characteristics of the cost burden households in DeKalb County, we see overall about 34% of non-elderly households are cost burdened, and just a slightly larger share, 35.8, are elderly. The big takeaway here is the high proportion of low-income households, those earning less than 50% of median income, that are cost burdened. Over 80% of households are making less than 50% of the area-wide median income, which at the time of this survey was about $86,000 as the median income. So we're talking about households in the low 40s or below. Next is if we look at shift from looking at cost burden, but look at the actual supply of housing based on whether or not those units are affordable by income category, we can see that at the 80% threshold, DeKalb looks pretty good compared to the comparison counties in terms of the proportion of rental units that are affordable, though we'll see in all of these counties, those shares have been declining over time, 2000 in blue, 2010 in orange, in 2019, the most recent in gray. But when we look to the lower income categories, very low income, 50% of AMI, or extremely low income, 30% of AMI, the share of units that are affordable to households at those levels in DeKalb compares less favorably to the comparison counties than we see at the 80% level. This just shows same information, but now we're looking at it from a spatial perspective, 30%, 50%, and 80% of AMI by census tracts, and looking at the proportion of rental units that would be affordable at these different income categories. So at the 80%, you see that most of the county is in the blue areas, which means at least half or more of the units are affordable. Move to the 50% marker, only a few, largely concentrated in this corridor here and a bit along I-20. And then 30%, none of the areas are in blue, and only a couple of areas are between 25 and 50%. Now let's look at the average rents, looking at rent changes over the period 2019 to 2021. We're looking here at the percentage change, and we're looking at this in 3 different areas. I think this is 2019, 2020, and 2021, looking at the average rents. The first 2 are average rents in 2019, average rent in 2021, and then the third map is showing that percent change. So we can see that the biggest rent increases have been largely in this kind of central south area of the county. If we turn to home purchases, we know a problem is with investor owners. More than half of the homes sold in 2021 in South DeKalb were purchased by investors. There have been media stories covering that. Here you kind of see what that looks like mapped out by zip code. And you can also see here at the metro level, Atlanta and Charlotte are the 2 metro areas that have seen the largest share of home purchases made by investors. So let's quickly look at assisted housing in the large urban counties. The good news is that DeKalb has the third highest share of subsidized rental units among the 11 counties included in the study, which indicates that the county has done a reasonably good job in terms of maximizing support available predominantly from federal sources for either a unit-based subsidy or a tenant-based subsidy. The somewhat disconcerting element of this is that DeKalb has a much larger share of its subsidized rental stock that's at risk of loss over the next 5 to 10 years compared to the other counties in the sample. So in order to preserve or hold on to the subsidized rental units that we currently have, we are going to need to find strategies to secure the continuation of these properties as subsidized units. This just gives you the numbers on the types of subsidies in the rental stock in DeKalb and the comparison counties. In DeKalb, we're predominant in most of the core counties in Atlanta. Most of the unit-based subsidies include some type of low-income housing tax credit, much higher percentages there than in the comparison counties. And then also relatively high share on Section 8, but again, not quite as high as in some of the areas. We're distinguished at the low end in the sense that we have much lower shares of public housing subsidies tied to a unit compared to some of the other jurisdictions that we looked at. This gives you a spatial distribution of where these unit-based subsidies are within the county. The shading of the census tracts that you see here are based on the percent of rental units that are affordable at 80% AMI. And the little circles that you see represent developments with unit-based subsidies, and then they're color-coded based on the primary type of subsidy that's attached to that particular development. One of the things to point out here is that if we break the county down into large kind of geographic areas, we look at this area up here north of I-85. A second area is south of I-85, but inside the 285 perimeter, and third south of 85 and outside the perimeter. We see a large difference in the share of rental stock that has a unit-based subsidy. About 17% of the rental units in this area south of 85, but inside 285, have a subsidy attached, with most of those properties being in this little arc here that suggests that much of the subsidized stock is concentrated in this part of the county. If we turn to tenant-based subsidy, we've got two charts here to look at. The one on the left are housing choice vouchers provided by the Housing Authority of DeKalb County. And the darker shaded areas represent areas that have where vouchers represent a larger proportion of renter households. And the map on the right looks at all housing authorities that are issuing vouchers that people residing in the county have received. Although this map on the right is a little misleading because the areas that are shaded white do not necessarily have no voucher households. It's just that the data is suppressed. This data comes from HUD, and any census tract that has 10 or fewer units are suppressed. So some of these tracts could potentially have housing voucher households in them, though they're not likely to be sizable compared to some of these other areas. But you see a similar pattern whether you look just at the DeKalb County Housing Authority or you look at all the housing authorities that are issuing vouchers and where folks live. Looking at the federal block grant funds, two things are notable here. On the left, we're looking at community development block grant funds, 2014, 16, and 19. And we're looking at the proportion of CDBG funds used for housing activities. DeKalb stands out given the relatively low proportion of CDBG funds that are being spent for housing. This red dashed line represents the average share of CDBG funds for housing among all entitlement jurisdictions. On the home side, we see DeKalb having a much more balanced use of home funds, home buyer in blue, home rehab in orange, rental assistance in gray, and tenant-based rental assistance in yellow, compared to the other counties that tend, many of them, to focus predominantly on home buyer. Looking now at the strategies, as I mentioned earlier, we looked at comparison counties benchmarked to DeKalb, looked at 3 types of strategies: housing production, which included things like housing trust funds, inclusionary zoning, low-income housing, utilization of low-income housing tax credits, presence of a housing finance corporation or authority, and workforce housing. We looked at preservation strategies, short-term rental regulation, land banks, preservation of federally subsidized housing, county tax relief, and grants for home maintenance. And then finally looked at asset building strategies, family self-sufficiency, homeowner education and assistance, housing co-ops, community land trust, and housing voucher home ownership programs. Let's move now to our recommendations. We organized them really around 3 sets of recommendations. The first set had to do with increasing the production or the supply of affordable housing. Oh, no, I'm sorry, just did that on the strategies. 3 sets of recommendations: get organized, develop strategies, and take action. On getting organized, one of our recommendations is the county should consider establishing a county affordable housing officer. A number of local jurisdictions have done this. It's a way to deal with the growing fragmentation of the types of strategies that can be undertaken among not just local government, but other private, nonprofit, philanthropic, federal, state sectors in dealing with housing, as some way to cut through and clarify and coordinate some of the complexity in terms of the financial tools and regulatory tools that need to be accessed to address the affordable housing challenge. Second is to establish a cross-sector collaborative advisory committee on affordable housing that encompasses a broad group of affordable housing stakeholders. Several counties and cities have recently established advisory committees and task forces to do just that. And we've given you some examples here of places that are doing that. Third would be to establish a comprehensive data and information system to track housing conditions and needs in the county and prepare and disseminate a regular report on housing trends and conditions. A number of local governments have developed kind of an annual or a biannual housing conditions report. We've given you some examples there of places that are doing that to give you some sense of the kind of information that's being compiled. Number 4 is to connect with other efforts in the county's municipalities and throughout the greater Atlanta region to promote and sustain affordable housing. There are a lot of different conversations and things happening, both within the county as well as within other parts of the region, where it would be good to have the county more significantly connected to these types of activities. Next, moving on to strategies. First is on our list is creating a strategic plan for affordable housing. Many places have done that. I think one of the most exciting is Prince George's County, their comprehensive housing strategy that they recently developed. There are links here to some of these strategic plans that have recently come out. Second is to assess the availability of affordable housing and the need for new investment. The report is really compiling kind of top-level numbers and trends, but we really need to dig down and look at some of those issues on that opening slide about the different dimensions of the affordable housing challenge and where do we have the greatest needs for new investment and how do we balance some of these competing claims or challenges to provide a fair and equitable set of strategies to help all DeKalb residents. Third is to think comprehensively. Addressing the affordable housing challenge is not just expanding the supply of affordable housing units. We need to think together about how we foster an income strategy that weaves together housing solutions with things like investing in education, vocational and technical education, workforce development, economic development, and the like, so that we can raise the incomes of DeKalb County residents to help them be more affordably housed. And then lastly, in the largest group is taking action. What are some things that can be done to mobilize additional resources for affordable housing? One would be to work with other local governments and affordable housing advocates to replicate Florida's State Housing Initiative Partnership. It's a very robust program that provides, it's funded through a state earmark of revenues that are derived from real estate transactions that generates about $150 million a year, which the state then distributes to all of the CDBG entitlement jurisdictions, 67 counties, 52 cities. Just for an example, Polk County and Volusia County, which are comparison counties in our study, are getting about $3 to $4 million a year through the SHIP program to be used for a variety of housing strategies. Second is to establish a county housing trust fund to support the county's affordable housing activities. National studies show there are about 70 counties in 17 states that have established housing trust funds as of 2021. All 11 counties in the state, in our analysis, have state housing trust funds, but only 3 counties, Polk, Volusia, and Prince George's, have established county housing trust funds. This was an issue that surfaced earlier. A 2010 study by the Livable Communities Coalition of Metro Atlanta suggested that the county establish a housing trust fund. 3 is, as I noted earlier, DeKalb is putting far fewer resources, CDBG resources for housing activities than the comparison counties. Much of that has to do with a Section 108 loan that was taken out a few years ago to support the construction of multi-purpose senior centers. And as that HUD 108 loan gets paid down, the county should redirect those funds for affordable housing activities. Fourth is to invest newly provided federal resources to assist state and local governments in responding to the needs of their most vulnerable residents to address affordable housing. This includes conventional housing and community development programs, as well as funds that have been provided through the American Rescue Plan, of which DeKalb County is receiving about $147 million. And the state and local fiscal recovery funds. These have to be committed by December 2024 and spent by December 2026. There are a number, get the right slide up here, a number of ways in which those funds can be used to support housing programs. They can include household financial assistance. It can include homelessness prevention and services, and include affordable housing development and rehabilitation. A recent review by the National Association of Counties looking at 200 county recommendations for how they're going to use these funds found that almost half included investments to support affordable housing and homeless services. And Prince George's County, for example, recently invested $15 million in their American Rescue Plan funds to support the preservation of affordable housing through their right of first refusal program, which is a way to preserve subsidized rental units that have their subsidies expiring to be able to continue those on. Just last month, the Treasury Department held a webinar on how these funds can be used for affordable housing and has highlighted the ways in which local governments and state governments can access these funds for affordable housing needs. A wide variety of ways in which they can build off of the current portfolio of federal housing assistance programs through a provision called expanded presumptive eligibility that enables these stimulus funds to be used for affordable housing development. There are a variety of things that can be done with these funds. Just some examples that I quickly looked at earlier today. Some governments are putting sizable amounts of their money into affordable housing. Washington, D.C. has put $323 million into a housing production trust fund. LA County has put almost $300 million into support for permanent supportive housing and related homelessness services. Harris County outside of Houston, $35 million to bolster housing vouchers. Tarrant County outside Dallas, $34 million for housing production. Maricopa County, $32 million for housing production. As I noted earlier, Prince George's was putting $15 million into the right of first refusal fund, also $8 million into homeless and $1 million for housing rehab. So they're spending close to 14% of their SLRF allocation for affordable housing. DeKalb's getting $147 million through these supplemental funds. If they spent a similar proportion as Prince George's County, that would mean about $20 million that could be invested in affordable housing. So number 5, complete a comprehensive assessment of the county's zoning and land use requirements is a way to address some of the financial and regulatory barriers to the development of affordable housing. 6, follow through on the comprehensive plans call for inclusionary zoning. 7, explore opportunities for using other public assets or public-private partnerships for the creation of affordable housing. 8, encourage the incorporation of affordable housing in transit-oriented development. 9, preserve rental units at risk with expiring subsidies. 10, preserve the county stock of naturally occurring affordable housing. 11, develop a comprehensive strategy for working with landlords. This is right on point with Commissioner Johnson's story that he shared from the AJC today to ensure the county's affordable housing stock is preserved and well maintained, as well as landlords are participating and willing to accept households with a housing voucher. And here's just some examples of strategies that can be used to work with distressed property investors and incentives for landlords to be more willing and able to provide affordable housing assistance. And I will stop there. I know I ran through quite a bit pretty quickly, but happy to take your questions or hear your reactions to our recommendations.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. That was a lot. And so I want us to, as a committee, to give us about 20, 30 minutes of question and answer time to ask Dr. Rich some questions. I'll start with Commissioner Davis Johnson, and then Commissioner Rader, then Commissioner Terry. In that order.
Okay. Thank you. Am I? Yeah. Thank you so much, Commissioner Johnson, for bringing in this presentation. I read the article today also from the AJC, and it was very just heartbreaking to me. But one other thing that I've had some constituents and people have come to me about was the fact that some units are taking apartment units, are taking application fees for those that are trying to get in apartments. And those application fees usually start at about $250, and they pay the application fee. They're encouraged to pay it, And then on the back end, they come back and say, well, I'm sorry, you don't qualify. Is it anything that the county can do to regulate or adjust how these landlords get monies from prospective tenants in a situation where they don't have that much money to begin with, to paying large application fees and then being denied and without getting any refund whatsoever?
That's a great question. I've heard that with some of the tenants trying to move to other places, they charge them $400 or $500. So they're making money off those. Mr. Allen, Mitchell, you have anything to add to that since you're working in the housing front?
I do not. We can get the landlord legal aid team as well as Metro Fair Housing to take a look at those two transactions. But beyond that, there's nothing that we can bring to bear. If I have specific examples, I can have those two agencies that we have contracts with take a look at those transactions.
Mr. Walker, you in the apartment industry, what are you all doing? Because you have a lot of folks who may be in that situation.
Yeah, we do. One of the things, it is a difficult situation. There's really not much that we can do because we're trying to encourage people to participate in the program. So if we started saying you can't participate if you require an application fee, that would reduce the number of people that participate in the program. We just try to educate our clientele to only apply when they really feel very confident that they will get the apartment. So that's what we can probably do, is try to educate our clientele as much as possible regarding, before you pay an application fee, let's feel really confident that you can get it, instead of just something that you really don't have a really good shot at. So in the meantime, what we're trying to do is participate in as many units as we can by either acquiring units or participating as partners, so that we can have some say as owners in this. So those are the steps that we're taking. In addition to that, we're trying to, with some of the money that we've gotten from like for the emergency housing voucher program, we're trying to have money that can be used as incentives. In other words, we can try to pay some application fees. Not a lot, but we'll be able to try to pay some of these application fees. But again, the biggest thing that we can do for everyone is to try to make sure they're as educated as possible before they make these applications.
And that's another issue. We'll put Commissioner Davis Johnson, the state has to help us with that as well, on regulations around that, because you can go to 5 apartments and pay $250. That's $1,000. But you plan as a crapshoot on if you're going to get into one. And that doesn't help us with families trying to afford a place to go. Any other questions you have on Commissioner Davis Johnson?
No, not right now.
All right, Commissioner Jeff Rader.
Thank you, Commissioner Johnson, and thanks for the presentation. Since we have gained some access to this report, I've been working my way through it, and I think that it is very data rich and provokes a lot of opportunities. It does occur to me that it would be relatively easy to develop some sort of a tool for potential applicants to use that would allow them to access their credit report, their free credit report, as well as to ensure that they are applying for an apartment that is affordable to them in terms of their documented income, that could at least serve as a threshold that would make it possible for them to determine whether or not they'd be qualified for that apartment. And then if notwithstanding adequate credit and income, they still get turned down, then I think that it would make sense to perhaps look a little bit deeper into those situations where people are turned down, even though they have sufficient income and sufficient credit to qualify for the housing, because that may be the result of some form of discrimination or exploitation of the application process. But I do think that there are some tools that we potentially could make available either through existing resources or, if we did have a housing officer to be able to develop a tool like that, so that folks would know the parameters upon which the decision is legally made and be able to satisfy themselves that they meet those criteria before they put down the money for the application. But beyond that, I'm interested in this issue of preservation of DeKalb's housing, existing affordable housing stock, because DeKalb County has more apartments than any other county in the state. And many of those apartments are sound structures that were well developed, but have suffered disinvestment over many years and are substandard. A recent AJC investigative report identified many substandard units, was able to correlate a great deal of service demand and potential crime associated with those substandard units. And, the extent to which DeKalb has a remaining affordable housing stock in the rental sector in particular, which is eroding based upon escalating rents. Nevertheless, a lot of that is because of the condition of that housing. There are two questions that I have, one of which, I hope that we can get some statistical answers on. And then the second is, relative to a policy that we currently have in place. The first is, I know that we have a stock of housing and those units are occupied by people that are paying levels of rent and that have levels of income. But do we have any estimate based upon our local economy, the jobs that are in DeKalb County, what the not demand, but the need in order to house DeKalb's workforce, what that distribution looks like, because I'm interested to the degree that DeKalb ends up, because of historically affordable housing, that we're housing, people that are employed in other areas that can't find affordable housing within those communities, because by all measures of equity, they should have the choice to be able to live near where they work. And I even see in DeKalb that our affordable housing is not well distributed in many of our job centers, that affordability is not there, and that you see people either commuting from other jurisdictions or into DeKalb for those better paying jobs in our job centers, and that DeKalb residents, of our lower priced housing may find that they have to travel likewise to their work. And Commissioner Johnson remembers the Mixed Income Communities Initiative that really focused on that particular dynamic. And I'd be interested to kind of see what our ideal distribution based upon DeKalb's economy would be as sort of a benchmark for us. And, if that's in the report, I haven't seen it yet, but I would be interested in that particular number. And then the second question, which may not be one that can be answered here, but I'd appreciate a report on it, either from, I did see our code compliance folks in here, is that we do have, I'm concerned about affordability being primarily driven by the condition of housing in DeKalb County, and that, we have housing affordable by decline instead of by design. And so I'm wondering if I could get some feedback and some report on the tools that we already have in place, such as our interior code compliance ordinance, as to, what has been the application of that ordinance, as well as other measures to make sure that the housing that we do have is safe and occupiable, that it's not, distributed amongst empty units or other units that are uninhabitable. And so I'd like Commissioner Johnson, if we could get some information on that particular dynamic. I'm wondering if Dr. Rich can speak to this issue of the preservation versus the creation of new housing, as the most cost-effective way to meet our, any housing goals that we try to establish. And based upon, the evaluation of our housing stock in DeKalb, whether, we should be focused on preserving and rehabilitating and improving some of the units that are currently affordable, but perhaps are substandard maintenance, versus trying to meet our affordable housing goals through the creation of new stock. And I do think that we do need an inclusionary zoning mandate so that, housing development costs reflect the inclusion of a portion of it for, low mod and workforce type housing. So I'll yield back to Dr. Rich to see if he can't respond to any of that. And then if Mr. Allen or Mr. Baker or somebody could tell me how I could get more information on our existing interior code compliance.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your comments. I'll try to address each of those to the best that I can. On your first question about the workforce, there are a couple of tools that potentially could be utilized to try to get a handle on that. There are some challenges with them. There's a data set that Census and the Labor Department have where you can look at the income based on, look at households in terms of where they live and what their income is. And then you can also look at where they work. So you could potentially look at households that live in a census tract within DeKalb County that are low income and then work outside DeKalb County. And that's annual data that's available. The challenge is the income level. This is a data set that's been around now for 10 or more years, but the income levels aren't updated. So they're not very good in terms of the range that they go, but we could take a look at that and relatively easily put a table or a chart together that would show that. There's also the possibility to get at some of the residential data based on where the low-income households live from the American Community Survey. The challenge becomes matching that up with the low-income jobs that would be available within the county, in the sense that we don't have a real good crosswalk between, say, occupation and what the wages are that those occupations play. But there's a potential way where you could look at it from the supply side. How many jobs do we have in DeKalb County that pay a livable wage or something along those lines? So there's a little bit that we could do there to try to shed a little bit more light on the kind of demand and supply piece. On your second question about code compliance, that I have to defer to the county administrative officials to really answer that. I will note that over the years, HUD and through CDBG and some other programs have had kind of comprehensive code enforcement kinds of programs or strategies that they have spawned and tried to encourage local governments to adopt. And then your third point about what's the most cost-effective approach to take. Many years ago, when I had less gray hair and I was getting started in this, I spent a year at the Department of Housing and Urban Development as an urban policy fellow. And I worked on a study that looked at rental housing rehabilitation programs. And the kind of analytic perspective we took on that was looking at basically a very simple formula of figuring out what the supply of affordable housing is. You look at units added through things like new development or substantial rehab or moderate rehab versus, and you add units that are preserved, units that are currently affordable, but maybe at the risk of loss, either for conversion to market rate units or units that are deteriorating in their condition that they may eventually have to be demolished. And then you add those two together. How many units did we add? How many units have we preserved? and then subtract from that the units that have been lost to give you some indication of, is our supply increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? Obviously, units added through production, new construction, are the most expensive route to go. Units preserved is far more effective, though this was around the time the first Section 8 program came online, and there was certainly a boon for new development. There was also a fair amount of substantial rehabilitation, though some of the early studies that were coming in showed that it was more expensive to substantially rehabilitate some properties than it would have been to just demolish and build them anew. So a lot of that preservation, what kind of level of rehabilitation do we want to invest? And that gets back to one of the dimensions I talked about at the very opening of my presentation, and that is, what level of intensity do we want to provide in our response? And I think that's really a question of figuring out what some of the larger needs are, and that's going to likely vary by geography. There may be some areas where there's a pretty dire shortage of affordable units, and you need to increase the stock, and so maybe new development makes sense there. There may be other parts where you have a pretty reasonable stock of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, and we need to maintain that. So it's not kind of a one size fits all. You really got to kind of balance that out and think about how production, whether it's through rehabilitation or new construction, is going to contribute to things like neighborhood stabilization and the implications, the larger implications that that strategy might have for a neighborhood. And what has happened over the years is we've shifted away from federal subsidies for production and largely put the federal subsidies on the demand side through the voucher program. But we just haven't kept pace in terms of the number of households that need assistance. And of course, by moving more toward a demand side, assuming that there are units out there that people with a voucher can occupy. The story that Commissioner Johnson mentioned in the paper today noted there are a lot of vouchers that go unused because holders can't find available units to do that. So the mix is going to vary within markets, and even within markets, it's going to vary within jurisdictions and neighborhoods in terms of how to sort that out.
All right.
Okay. Good.
Yeah,
And again, that whole idea of trying to ensure that the naturally occurring affordability isn't so vulnerable to these market forces that we're now encountering in terms of the commercialization of particularly single family housing, and then trying to ensure that if we use the mechanisms that we have available in terms of code compliance, which I'll get more information on, to present a value proposition to apartment operators that they need to work with us to rehab those units and to keep them affordable. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll yield back and maybe I'll have another question.
Yes, and he left something that Mr. Allen, I hope you jot down. Commissioner Rader had a question that you want to answer later on. And he wanted something around, I don't know, maybe it's probably for planning when you look at the codes that you talked about and deterioration of apartments and homes. So I forgot what it was, but I hope you all wrote it down. That we can
related to interior code compliance, I think.
Right. So let's bring that back for us. And then I'll skip my questions. I'll come back after Commissioner Ted Terry, and I'll let him ask his questions, and we'll get ready for our second half after that. Commissioner Ted Terry.
Professor Rich, for your presentation. I did read your 2018 housing study. And then I read the update here. It's one of my main motivations for introducing the housing committee. as a legislative agenda item for us, our legislative agenda. It is in the PECS committee. I believe it's coming back in a few weeks or a month or so. So I believe that we already have something on the agenda to immediately take action on, at least one of the recommendations that you put forward in your study. When I read the article from today's AJC about the housing vouchers, what I read was housing discrimination based on source of income. When I was mayor, the city of Clarkson passed a non-discrimination ordinance. At the time, we tried to include a source of income portion of that as a violation of the discrimination ordinance. It did not pass, however, because some folks in the apartment community felt that would be a burden to them. I think you've laid out, and I think we see here in the AJC that if we do not address that discrimination, that the consequences for some of our most vulnerable residents is pretty dire. They literally will not have a place to live. When I read that article, two emotions come to my mind. One is sorrow for the individuals who are in that situation. But the second emotion that is the strongest emotion is motivation to do something about it. Because when ordinary people look at a headline like that, they think, what are we to do? But when 7 of the most powerful people in DeKalb County and an 8th person, a CEO, look at that article, hopefully that motivation turns into action, because the average person can't do anything about it. But us 7, we can do a lot about it. And what you've laid out here today in your study, and I did notice that really the recommendations haven't changed that substantially from 2018 to today. And the only thing that I would add, and this is just encouragement for all of us, is that we're not here to collect titles. We're not here to get our name on a building. We're here to represent the people. This is not our commission seat, our CEO seat, it's the people's seat. And we need to represent our people. And our people are crying out for help. We're in a housing crisis, and we're not alone in this crisis, but a crisis dictates action, and it dictates action now. And so, Mr. Chair, I'm ready to move forward on a lot of those recommendations. I stand ready to support, sponsor, advocate, work with the committee members in every way possible to see that a lot of these recommendations are carried out. And I think we've already got a pretty great agenda that, Mr. Chair, you put together here over the last, these next several months, where DeKalb, I think, will have the opportunity to show itself as a leader in addressing not just the affordability crisis, but all of the aspects of what you've laid out in your report. So thank you so much for all those probably thousands of hours that your team has put together. And just know that, it's been well received by myself, and I'm committed to taking it from here along with my colleagues to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Terry. And what we'll do with those recommendations is, as a committee, we will bring them all back after we hear a couple of more presentations over the next couple of month or two. And then we'll ask the committee members to look at them to see what we can do, because a lot of them are based on state requirements, CEO requirements. And so we will make a recommendation. But like the article said, we had probably, how many city council people are there? About 13, the most powerful people. And they passed an ordinance that could not go into effect until we got the state of Georgia involved. And so, although the ordinance was good and well intended, the landlords didn't have to follow it because the state of Georgia has not tried to put a law in place to make sure that income would not be used as discriminatory tool. So that's what we'll do. Based on our presiding officer talked about that as well, coming up with legislative priorities to make sure we can influence those type of policies as well. Let's move forward. Commissioner Bradshaw, and then we'll move to our next set of speakers.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize if I'm belaboring your timetable. I just wanted to, first of all, commend Dr. Rich for the study. Couple quick questions. Number one, regarding the term investors, you had mentioned, a lot of homes are being acquired by investors. Do you have a functional definition of an investor? And the reason I ask is because I was a real estate investor. I didn't have 1,000 houses. I had 2, but I was still a real estate investor. So I'm wondering if there's a functional definition that we're using for that.
Sure. So a couple of different ways to kind of look at that. I mean, one is people like yourself, kind of mom and pop type of people looking to kind of get a way to kind of provide some income or security down the road. Sometimes investors live in the same, are people that, obviously investors are people who buy a home but don't live in it. Sometimes they live in the neighborhood, sometimes not. In prior years, this has been an issue that's kind of ebbed and flowed over time with the concern about if we have too many investor owners, what happens to the neighborhood. But more recently, what we're seeing are kind of LLCs and other types of, they're more like corporate investors, if you will, that are putting together a portfolio of properties. They're trying to, kind of buy low and hope over time they can squeeze some income out of it and potentially get some appreciation. And so that is, I think the problem when people talk about investor owners now, that's the issue people are most sensitive to. And obviously it's gotten some attention since the Washington Post published a story earlier this summer about a widespread investor purchasing that's happening in the single family market in a number of metro areas.
Understood. Thank you. And then with regard to one of your first recommendations about an affordable housing officer, and maybe Mr. Chair, we'll flush this out later, but just curious if that recommendation comes with a job description template, a recommendation for compensation, and a recommendation for how big a staff they should have.
So I think in our report, we provide some links to different places that local jurisdictions that have created that position. And I think there are some sample job descriptions or sample roles and responsibilities that those individuals are fulfilling. I haven't gone into the weeds to come up with a compensation package or size of staff or where within local government they're situated, but just that a growing number of places are catching on to the need to create such a position. There, over the last decade, has been a big diffusion of innovation, if you will, regarding a chief sustainability officer dealing with issues around climate change and the environment and sustainability. And we're now starting to see local governments create the position of kind of chief affordability officer, or chief housing officer, or what have you, given in part the growing fragmentation of responsibility for dealing with housing problems that are scattered not only across units of local or agencies within a local government, but also coordinating with the nonprofit sector, with philanthropy, with federal and state governments, et cetera. And this is just somebody who gets up every day thinking about how can we push forward in our efforts to expand the supply of affordable housing.
Understood. Thank you so much. I yield back to the chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Bradshaw. You brought up 2 good questions for me, Dr. Rich, right quick. One is to look at the what I would say, when you look at investors, you said half of the homes went to, I guess, LLCs, but the other half went to just mom and pop or just individuals. So part of the scenario I think that's been printed out is that you can delineate between LLCs and mom and pop investors when you create laws, when all of them are using the same mechanism to buy homes. So can you create a law that separates LLCs from just individual mom and pop investors?
Well, 2 things. Number one, I didn't say, or if I did, I misspoke. We don't know the relative proportion of how many of the characteristics of the investor owners, that half are this and half are that. We do know that the pool of investor owners is more diversified now than it has been typically in the past when we've been concerned about these issues. And we're seeing a large increase in the number of kind of the large corporate buyers, if you will. whether or not a law can be created that has different types of requirements based on the type of investor, I don't have legal training. I can't answer that question. It's an important one, and one that we might look to some guidance to see what actions, if any, local governments around the country have taken to try to combat this problem that has risen. There are some people who feel there should be a regulatory response. Other people who argue it's my property or my money, I should be able to do what I want with it, and I shouldn't have the government tell me what I can buy or sell or what have you. So I have to yield to someone who has more familiarity with the laws, and in particular in terms of what local governments can do in that regard. Maybe your law department or somebody at Emory Law or one of the other law schools can provide some guidance on that.
Thank you so much, and hang around if you can. Now we're going to move to
Sure.
our two guests that are very instrumental in the housing space and world. The director for the DeKalb Housing Authority, Mr. Pete Walker, will go first, and then we'll hear from Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership, because I want to focus not only on rentals, but also home ownerships. Like you stressed, Dr. Rich, this is a multifaceted issue. Housing could be ownership, single family apartments. And so from the report and the study, it just outlined, I think, 6 sectors. I think they talk about tools, and I can't put them up right quick, but you outlined them. And I think that's a good read for us as commissioners to go through and keep this conversation within those 6 sectors that and I'm not saying the right words you said, but it was like 6 of them. But I'll turn over to Mr. Walker, and I want him to talk about the affordable housing and how it's done and funding. And thank you, Mr. Walker, for being a part.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Johnson. Can everyone hear me okay? Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I thank you for this opportunity to kind of talk about what we do at the Housing Authority. And so you had indicated you wanted me to kind of talk about where we're operating, what kind of properties we have, and I'll kind of go over that fairly briefly. And because I really want to be able to answer some questions and be able to also provide some of the challenges that we have. As you may know, we used to own property. Well, Johnson Ferry was a public housing site up at Ashford, Dunwoody, and Johnson Ferry Road, the intersection there, 55 acres. We redeveloped that site into Ashford Landing, Ashford Parkside, Hearthside at Brookley, and several other, became a mixed income, mixed use community there. We also had the site at Toby Grant, which is now Mills Creek Crossing, retreated Mills Creek. We redeveloped that into also 3 senior housing developments, along with a family development, and now a housing for sale housing development is also going up there as well. So I didn't know how far you wanted me to go into that, but I wanted to make sure that, like I said, I got to answer some questions. I can also give you some of the things that we're working on right now.
Yeah, that's what I want people to hear,
Right.
that the ones you've done successfully in the past, but also
Right.
what you're working towards, that people can see that affordable housing is coming or is in DeKalb.
Right. So one of the things that we've been able to develop is an excellent partnership with MARTA. And the first transactions that we're going to be working on, that we're working on right now, is at the Kensington Transit Station. We're working in partnership with LDG Development to build 244 units that are currently under construction there. And then we're also working on our own development that we're the lead development, called Kensington Point and Kensington Family. They'll be right at the corner of Kensington and Memorial Drive. It'll be 130 units of senior development and 120 unit family development. And we'll be moving our office there from 750 Commerce here. We're also working with, we just completed a development, Peachtree Creek on Ponce. That was a partnership with Blue Ridge Atlantic. On the books right now, we're working in partnership with the Integral Group on Veranda at Assembly, which is at the old GM site. We're doing 100 units there of senior housing. We're working on an acquisition, currently 406 units, Hills at Farrington, which is obviously on Farrington Road, Hillendale and Farrington. We've been working with Prestwick Development on 2 developments. One of them called Fullerton, 248 units. And both of these are at the intersection where Columbia Drive becomes Clifton Springs there off of Flat Shoals. Fullerton, 248 units, and Aurora, which is a housing for older persons development, also with Prestwick. And then we're also doing a couple of transactions with Mercy Housing on Claremont, right just north of Peachtree DeKalb Airport. There's a space right there between 5th and 6th Street that we're going to be doing 2 developments with them, 167 units family and 155 unit senior development. Also just in the works and not really in the actual implementation stage yet. We're looking at working with a couple of hotel owners and trying to do some single room occupancy hotels. I mentioned our MARTA partnerships that we're very excited about, trying to work with a couple of different, including Indian Creek, MARTA station that we're trying to work with them on. Everything is in the embryonic stages there. We're hoping to work with various churches throughout the community to try to work with them. So we've had some meetings with them, trying to work with churches. We're looking at properties on Candler Road. We're working in Stonecrest, trying to work, they actually have a housing authority. And we're working with the city of Stonecrest to kind of implement their strategy as well, because it's within DeKalb County, obviously. So there's a number of different things that we're working on with those various entities and in those various locations. But I did want to speak to some of the questions that I heard earlier. I kind of addressed Commissioner Johnson's questions about application fees, what we might be able to do to try to help some of that. And it included a lot of education. We have to make sure that our clientele are as educated as possible. And one thing I need to add, or when I say we're developing, the tools we primarily use are 4% tax credits and 9% tax credits. We've been fortunate in that we have a really good, we've developed a great reputation as far as being able to develop. So now we even have access to some private equity money. And we're using those funds to acquire in properties like Hills at Farrington. And we're looking in those areas that we're looking to acquire other properties. But the challenges that we have that we really, I'm not sure what the answer is, are that prices have increased significantly all over. And here in DeKalb, they've definitely increased. When I say prices have increased, I'll give you an example. We were trying to acquire a property in Central DeKalb about 2.5 years ago. And we bid $180,000 a unit for that property. And we didn't get it. Somebody got it for, I think, $185,000 a unit. 2.5 years later, that same property went up for sale. And we bid $275,000 a unit. And it went for $280,000 a unit. So this is multifamily 200+ unit properties that are selling for over $280,000 a unit in Central DeKalb County. So just to give you a range of what we're looking at and trying to, Commissioner Rader asked a great question about, how are we going to preserve, and that's what we're really trying to do, preserve affordability. But there's such a tremendous influx of investor money. And when I say investors, institutional investors. My experience has been institutional investors are now seeing that real estate is a great investment. It's better than the stock market for them. So they're coming in and they're getting pretty good returns, but they have billions of dollars to spend. And they're quite honestly overspending on this, but they're still getting a fairly decent return. And that's what's making that, coupled with supply chain issues, making prices increase dramatically. When we're trying to acquire properties in South DeKalb, they range between $110,000 and $180,000 a unit. When we're trying to acquire properties in Central DeKalb, it's $180,000 to $280,000 a unit. And when you're in North DeKalb, it's basically $280,000 to $380,000. Some of them are even going for $400,000 a unit. And when you are building property, new construction right now is costing $235,000 a unit. So that's why a lot of these institutional investors that have these billions of dollars are coming in and just doing the easy math and saying, I'll just buy some houses and I'll buy a whole portfolio of houses. And now you have the huge companies like Lennar, they're coming in and even just building whole subdivisions and renting, particularly in Gwinnett, places like Gwinnett. So some of the challenges that we have are dramatic, and what we're asking, that we all help to do is increase the amount of tax credits, because that's the key to us being able to acquire these properties. That's the best tool that we have to acquire these properties and maintain some level of affordability. No matter what we do, rents are going to go up. And one of the things that we've done as an organization is get our board to approve going to 120% of the payment standard. And the payment standard is basically, there's a study done and provided by HUD of what the payment standard for each zip code should be in a community. And rather than paying 100% of the payment standard, which we've been doing and found ourselves to be pretty competitive until now, is we've had to go up to 120% of the payment standard. In other words, if we normally would pay $1,000 maximum for a 30002 zip code, now we can pay $1,200 a month. And any number we could pay, that 20% higher so that we can be competitive. And we are running into the problems that they indicated in the article today. There are a lot of people who, quite frankly, just discriminate against people who have housing choice vouchers. They don't want that money. They don't want the issues associated with that. So we have some significant challenges, but we're working our way through them. And I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of the on the ground up to the second challenges that we have. And if we can try to do anything, it's the biggest thing we can do overall from the federal government is continue to encourage expansion of the tax credit program, in particular 9% tax credits, because they provide 9% tax credits. You get 70 or 80% equity that you don't have to pay back. You have a $20 million project, then you're getting, if you get 80% equity, you get $16 million, and then you don't have to pay that back. You only owe $4 million, and that way you can pay less rent for a $20 million. You could charge less rent on a $20 million project. 4% tax credits, you get about 40% equity. Similarly, and the difference is that 9% is competitive, but 4% is not competitive. But because of the influx of all these new investors, that tool has been limited significantly here in DeKalb County. We have 800,000 people here, but we're limited to only 2 transactions per year. And so if we got more tax credits, we'd be able to do more deals and help more people. But we've been able to do a good job of leveraging partnerships with other entities. As I named the various entities that we're working with, all of them are really good developers, and we continue to try to do that. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew some of the challenges that we're working with, and be able to try to answer any questions that you might have as we continue to try. And I do need to add one other type of transaction that we're very interested in trying to execute, are 55 and older subdivisions. They have a lot of those in Gwinnett, and we don't have any, and we don't have many to speak of here in DeKalb. So, and we think probably the best avenue there is to partner with churches to do that, to build kind of cottage communities or smaller home communities, 55 plus, So those are some of the things that we're focused on right now. And I'm open to try
Thank
to
you.
answer any questions. I know I was giving you a lot there, but
That's all right. We gonna get through it. I just want one thing to put down for staff, that tax credit. That's something I want us to put down as one of the items we look at for legislative purposes as we get down the line. But now I'll open it up. I saw Commissioner Rader, Commissioner Johnson. You had a question? Davis Johnson, no question?
I did.
And I got Commissioner Rader. If not, I'm gonna go to Commissioner Terry.
I did.
Okay, come
Oh,
on, Commissioner Rader. then
So
Commissioner
my
Terry.
question is, one of the themes I think of Dr. Rich's presentation is that it does take a partnership to address this particular issue. And for those members of the commission and others that aren't aware of it, Mr. Walker, could you remind us of, sort of the governance structure of the housing authority and how it's linked to the county?
right. Yes, sir. Thank you. So the Housing Authority is governed by a board of commissioners appointed by a combination of the DeKalb County CEO and approved by the commissioners. So the CEO will say, I have a commissioner that I'd like to appoint, and then the commissioners have to approve it. And then that person then becomes commissioner of the DeKalb County Housing Authority. And I report to that board. So we're a public, what was called a public body corporate of the county. So we don't specifically report to the county, but we report to a board created by the county.
And can you remind me of the terms of those housing commissioners and give me a profile of, available seats on that board, or currently, available for appointment?
They're initially appointed with 5-year staggered terms so that they don't all go off at the same time in theory. But I will be very candid with you and say that it has probably been 10 to 11 years since any of them have been reappointed. So all of the terms have expired, and we have been, trying to get them reappointed, but it just hasn't been a priority at this point from the CEO's office at this point.
Great. And could you provide us with, the members of the board and perhaps their profile, and, contact information so that we can, develop a relationship? Because obviously those relationships between these corporate bodies, politic, are important for us, whether it is our development authority or the MARTA board or our housing authority, to work closely in alignment with each other. And we want to be faithful to that partnership. So thank you.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you so
That's-
much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner Rader. We'll go to Commissioner Terry.
Appreciate Mr. Walker. He mentioned the potential opportunity for us to partner with the Housing Authority to develop smaller scale cottage communities focused on seniors. That's something that we heard on our housing symposium last week. Commissioner Johnson, seniors are concerned about not being able to continue to afford living in their own neighborhood, while also having sort of this kind of crisis where it's affordability versus, basically aging in place. And I think the challenge Mr. Walker pointed out is that because land is so expensive, that oftentimes the land that might be available might be rather isolated from any activity center or even proximity to a neighborhood where a senior citizen might want to continue to sort of be in the vicinity of. I think about the senior center and nursing home on Lawrenceville Highway that, basically is a six lane highway and there's some sidewalks, but if you want to walk somewhere, you're going to have to take a mile hike. When we were talking about the North DeKalb Mall development, the first thing I said was, how do we get a larger sidewalk up to that senior center? Because I'm sure they'd like to be able to walk and bike and access this new activity center we're building just, 3/4 of a mile down the road. So I think the point he made there about, thinking about different types of housing with these, whether they're low income housing tax credits or just available land. The beauty of the cottage court ordinance that the PECS committee and the zoning agenda is looking at is that, we can look at half-acre, 1-acre lots and build smaller communities within existing neighborhoods. We know the DeKalb Land Bank and I guess the government in general has what 600, 700 parcels. A lot of them are vacant. Some of them have old homes on them. But imagine redevelopment opportunities in the hundreds in every neighborhood in DeKalb County that would activate more affordable, local-based senior housing opportunities. The great thing about freeing up about seniors downsizing is that they often live in larger homes. We know there's a mismatch between available square footage and the demographics looking for different types of sizes. So if a empty nester or a single senior is living in a 3,000 square foot home, if they downsize to a cottage home, their home now becomes available for that family that needs the larger home. And this is part of the dynamism in the housing market that we need to promote here in DeKalb. One thing I think that's important that always strikes me is that, a lot of nonprofit boards generally have term limits on their board members. The idea is you want to keep fresh ideas and fresh perspectives moving in and out of a board. It's great to get new people on the board of commissioners because new ideas are brought forward, new energy. And so I'm a little concerned that if we have a set of board members who have literally been there for 12 or 15 years, is it possible that their level of thinking hasn't changed? Maybe it has, but maybe it hasn't. The test of that would be to just either reappoint them or to put forward new appointees. So I would encourage us to continue to ask that question of why can't we get some reappointments done, or at least some new folks considered. We've heard from affordable housing developers that have said that the current tax assessor scheme and paradigm for tax assessment of low income tax credit properties tends to be skewing towards the market-based approach and not the income-based approach. To such, they have written us a letter going on months now saying that they will no longer do business in DeKalb County because they will immediately be taxed at a higher rate by our own tax assessor, which is governed by another board independent of us. And so the big question is, how can we continue to expand LIHTC developments if in year one these developments immediately become unprofitable or lose so much of their income that it could potentially degrade the services that are provided on site for those residents. The final thing I want to draw attention to is I do think that we need to be working more closely with planning, sustainability, as well as the fire marshal. I'm aware, Mr. Walker mentioned the project in Clarkston off of Ponce. I'm aware that there was, between the lawsuit that the city of Tucker filed that delayed that project for months and months, causing almost $1 million in legal fees, but also the just miscommunication and somewhat kind of confusing guidelines coming out of the fire marshal's department about signage, about grab bars, about sprinklers, and to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars in sort of redos and renovations that had to be done after the work had already been done, delaying opening and costing the developer even more money, which ultimately is going to be passed on in some form or fashion down the line. And so the important thing to note here is that we know all these problems. We're told about them. I'm aware of them. I read the reports. I'm listening to what the experts are saying. I'm listening to the community. And again, they're asking us to do something about it. And at some point, we have to take action. And I'm gonna leave with this one comment, because what I heard earlier was that we will continue to think about what we want to get from the federal and state leaders. Well, if we read the tea leaves, Larry Sabato's crystal ball basically right now projects that the Republicans will pick up 20 House seats. The Republican Tea Party, in my opinion, doesn't care about affordable housing. And I don't see them putting any more money into affordable housing tax credits. And so I think we need to have a plan for the likely inevitability of a split Congress. And we all know what happens in split Congresses: nothing. nothing gets done. And so if we put all of our eggs in the let's wait for our federal and state leaders to do something about it, we will continue to wait. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Democrats, hope Hank Johnson's in the majority, hope Nikema Williams, Ossoff, and we think we're going to hold the Senate. But if we put all our eggs on the federal basket, it ain't going to happen. And so we need to be prepared to immediately act locally in our own powers. And every little piece here, every little sliver, whether it's the tax assessment, the fire marshal, our development standards, how we look at different housing types, these are all things that are in our own home rule power, our own jurisdiction, and we don't have to wait for anybody. We can do it ourselves right now.
All right, thank you so much. And I just want to add to that, DeKalb, I'm just one commissioner, never waited for anybody to do anything. And if you look at my track record in terms of housing, period, and Mr. Mitchell is on here, he can tell you, we worked hard on focusing on affordable housing. I mean, this last ARPA money that we use to help people who are renting, and I don't know how much money it is, and Mr. Williams can tell us, to help sustain people for 2 years. That has been more than just waiting. That's been proactive that the county has done. But you're not going to get much done without your help of your federal and state partners. Dr. Rich has touched on that. The state has touched on that. And we showed in the article again that you had city council member pass something that, long as the state did not back it up, those residents who are discriminated against for incomes did not get the help that they needed. So we have to be methodical. We have to less influence and move forward. But I hope no one leaves here today leaving that the chair is asking us not to do nothing when we've had track record of DeKalb. And you've shown that through the subsidized housing we got. I think Dr. Rich showed it. We're like the third county in terms of subsidized housing. And that's been done over the years. And we need to focus on how we're going to keep that housing. And then also Commissioner Rader talked about it, make it more quality, but it's going to require more than just the county. And Dr. Richards said that again, it's more than just us. It's not going to be the county can do this by themselves because we didn't get in the problem by ourselves. It's going to require federal, state, private developers, working with HUD, working with the folks on these calls to make it happen. We'll get to ANDP, we'll show you a program that we work with the private industry to do, but I'll go to Commissioner Marita Davis Johnson.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll just say this, because I'm in agreement. We're doing what we can. And I think in a lot more, we're very proactive. You know, I mean, I've put over $600,000 just to help people maintain where they are and get to a better place. I think we would be doing a disservice to our citizens to give them expectations that are not there. You know, when I'm working with people, I'm letting them know who to go to, where to go, but I'm just not going to give them any false expectations, because I know that our hands are tied. Some people may think that we're the most powerful people in DeKalb. You know, I mean, you know, maybe you could say we want to be some of the most influential folk
Right.
in DeKalb, but power, you know, you give people in yourself a false expectation of what your abilities really are. And then people start calling and people start emailing saying that you can do A, B, and C, which you should know from the beginning, we can't do A, B, and C, but we can help you to get housing if there's a need. Now, I am partnering with some private partners to see what we can do in DeKalb. And I'm glad that you talked about the tax incentive, because there are things that we can do. But with the state partnership, and I'll agree with Ted, we don't know what's going to happen with the federal government, but we do know what's going to happen with the state. And many of your state legislators are landlords. And if you don't know that, research it. And they're only going to do so much, and and I learned that. So, I just say, let's not give people false expectations, but let them know that we have worked, we will continue to work, and we will do all that we can to try to eliminate some of the homelessness that we see in DeKalb County. But we are not all powerful, and if you open that curtain behind the wiz, we're not back there, so I just want people to know that, so that the expectations that may be given the citizens are not in our power. And I just want people to know that, but they can depend upon us working day and night to do what we can do to eliminate the homelessness. And I really want to look into the application fees, because those application fees, you're taking rental money when you're given those application fees, and then you're boom, denied. And so I don't think it's just, but in any event, just wanted to say that.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bradshaw, and then we'll move to our next guest.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just make a macro point. I think as a general construct, we're all in favor of more affordable housing. But I will say this, based on experience, that term of art still has some negative connotations. It just does. And I will go back to something Mr. Walker mentioned earlier. He mentioned the development LDG. That's a zoning that Commissioner Gannon and I did a few years ago for affordable housing, right by the Kensington Mars station, which to me is the most sensible place in the world to put affordable housing. But the resistance came from the surrounding communities. And when I say resistance, I mean Steve getting jumped at meetings about why you want to put that near us. Well, we approved it anyway because it was the right thing to do. But I think we should all be cognizant of the macro environment that while we want affordable housing, God knows I do. I don't know, that term of art just strikes some people the wrong way. And we should just think through that and be cognizant of potential resistance, because I'm not talking theoretical. I'm talking what I lived through in getting those 244 units approved. And I yield back to the chair.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move to our John O'Callahan from the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. And I wanted him to talk about housing from a home ownership standpoint in the program that we have at DeKalb as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to you and other board members. Thanks for this robust discussion. There are more members of this board that are up to speed and paying attention to this issue. And we've had some great partnerships in DeKalb. Michael Rich, thank you for your research. I'll add ANDP is now, we believe, the top producer of homes that are available or affordable to homeowners that may be at middle income or below. We aren't doing enough, but we actually learned some of this work through Alan Mitchell's team and the Neighborhood Stabilization Program. We'd done 6 homes before that and learned a lot. I am going to focus on our homeownership work, and I'll go to the next slide that gets a little bit of what ANDP is doing today. Commissioner Radar, you remember, and Commissioner Larry Johnson, our early policy work on mixed income housing. We believe in that. We're thankful that there are others that are involved in the policy space. We're spending more of our time today in the production to sort of find new ways to produce some of the housing that's needed. We continue to do community engagement and advocate. We do lending. We're a community development financial institution. So we lend to smaller developers and not-for-profits that develop affordable housing. We provide down payment assistance. We're a member of the Federal Home Loan Bank and have some of their dollars and sometimes have others. And I think our best work is actually as a developer of affordable housing. And in DeKalb County, our work has overwhelmingly been based on home ownership. And since 2008, when we had been small in the home ownership space and really learned through the neighborhood stabilization program with DeKalb, we've developed 300 predominantly for sale single family homes. There are some single family rental homes, which are also important. So thanks to DeKalb, y'all's work with us has helped us serve other counties as well. Next slide, George. We had learned this with governmental money, but Pete Walker runs an amazing housing authority. He told you that if you get the right type of tax credit, that the federal government pays for 80% of the project, right? You only need to borrow 20%. In home ownership, the federal government gives upper income people a tax deduction, so they help with home ownership. But if you do not itemize your taxes, there are very few resources for home ownership. The neighborhood stabilization program, a little bit of money's left because DeKalb's been a steward and rotated it, but not much. There are home dollars. There are CDBG dollars. Those can be used for home ownership, but they're used for rental and other means. There's not a lot of money. So part of our work is how do you take those little and governmental resources for home ownership and leverage them? And we decided to do a pilot working with the CO and all the Board of Commissioners then have updated some new ones to do 100 homes that largely were not governmental. We did receive some home dollars. And so we did a handful with governmental dollars that came through DeKalb, but largely we raised from banks, social impact investors, a pot of money where we didn't have to get a construction loan, and we hired small, underfunded, largely in the communities we serve, they're local, Black-owned businesses, home builders that would buy homes and rehab it and work with us to sell it or build new construction homes. And we were able to meet that goal and develop 100 homes. The goal was around, could we invest $20 million and secure at least 100 homes, get them started during the 3-year period or sell them. We are pleased that we finished that 3-year plan with 109 homes. We squeaked in for the $20.2 million. We had thought we might lend a little bit more money in DeKalb, and we're working to get some of that out. But we did our best work when we directly invested in some of these small builders, shared risk, shared profit, shared losses with them. And it was a fabulous success. I will add, though, what was key to that was there were some charitable grant monies. And one of the things DeKalb needs to do is, I think, get attention not only for housing, but others, because so often, it's just not in Atlanta, charitable funders really focus on the central city. But we know the needs in suburban areas, particularly older suburban communities like DeKalb, are just as high. And as we get to the recommendations, I'll be recommending to y'all, how do we work together to get those charitable dollars? We were able to leverage those charitable dollars with some of the capital we'd raised from banks to apply for highly competitive U.S. Treasury programs. They do not flow through the state, do not flow through the county, and they include new markets tax credits. We've applied for 40 million and have served DeKalb and Fulton and some other counties through that. those are treasury dollars that can be used for home ownership. We've applied for capital magnet funds and just won our 4th award for $1 million. You have to stretch that million. And so we are really trying to find ways to take a little bit of local leverage, your home dollars, local charitable dollars, and provide a greater leverage by getting competitive federal grants. We were successful with this Home South DeKalb. Let's go to the next one. So in rental housing, there is such a need. Not everyone can manage home ownership, but today Metro Atlanta is a place, particularly when you look at some of the racial wealth gaps, there is a larger race-based wealth gap between Black and white home ownership today than there was in 1968 when it was legal to discriminate. We are working on that gap. And with a little bit of subsidy, you can make home ownership accessible, affordable. I agree. We have to be careful with the terms we use, but accessible housing and create wealth and stability. We studied those in DeKalb and elsewhere that had been in their homes for 5 years or more in Metro Atlanta. And we found that 93% after 5 years were still there. Their kids were still in the same school. Those that had moved largely moved for good reasons. They had economic opportunity. Almost none were lost to foreclosure. Great outcomes. We found that these predominantly lower to middle income families had increased their wealth by $135,000. We found that while rents were increasing, if you set your mortgage 5 years ago, your average mortgage payment was $717. So your housing cost was not going up. And ANDP, it's got sort of who we serve. We're particularly active in communities that have been disrespected and disinvested because of race over literally centuries, but particularly since the advent of the mortgage. And you can see some of those stats. Let's go to the next one. I'll give an example. So prices are up. Most of our homes just a couple years ago were selling for $180,000. Prices are up, but we worked with a small, underfinanced, Black-owned development firm who helped identify a property. And we said, let's invest together. We're going to provide most of the capital. You provide the labor and the technical expertise. And if we sell for a profit, great, we'll share that with you. But if we sell for a loss, you're going to get paid less than a fee. And that model's really helped us. Hardeman Construction. We were able to apply for New Markets tax credits, which is a federal government program that doesn't provide 80% of what it costs, but does provide 10 or 15%. We were able to use that as a risk so we could develop more homes than we would, because we knew if we lost, we had a little bit of a buffer. In these homes, the market did well, and we were able to turn those federal dollars into down payment assistance, up to $30,000 for veterans that are also lower income, and match that with other down payment that they may be able to have. The units are under buyer contract. A large percentage, 40%, are being sold to households at below 80% of area median income. We go up to middle income, 120%. And this is the type of projects we're doing. We do some acquisition rehab, but today, many of the home prices are so high that a smaller new construction home might cost the same as a larger, older home that needs some rehab. Another example, worked with the City of Decatur Development Authority. We talked a little bit about public land and what is available in DeKalb County. This was one of our first times working with public land anywhere for home ownership. And we were able to secure some sites right near downtown Decatur through the Development Authority, work with one of our, again, great small contractors. Again, this one is Black owned, and are developing a small cottage feel subdivision. At the end, these homes will sell for 200 to 275,000. They're smaller. That's key to making them less costly. But because of the subsidy put in by the city, we didn't have to buy the land. So at the end, these homes, the land will transfer to the Decatur Land Trust so that the homeowners can get some return, but when they sell it, that home is going to remain affordable. And we were able to develop it at a price where the first mortgage for those buyers is going to be low. Great project. I think the impact is going to be bigger than the 6 or 7 homes because we're going to learn a lot from it. Let's go to the next one. Y'all sort of know what the gaps are. Michael Rich did a great study. Everyone's aware. I just want to focus in this, the connection between racial wealth gap and housing is home ownership. My dad fought in World War II. He got out. He got into Georgia Tech just by being white and a college graduate. He got out of Georgia Tech and he got a VA loan at near 0% and very little down. He opened a small business. There were hard times. He was able to get money out of the house. He was able to help me get through Georgia Tech. If you wanted to buy a home in any community that had even one household of color coming out of World War II, up to in some areas up to 1968, you couldn't do it if you were a family of color. Even if you were a white family and wanted to go into a neighborhood that had one family of color, you couldn't do it. And to the extent that we can get more resources to do accessible housing that is home ownership, we get a double bang on the buck. Some of the issues that y'all have hit, I'm glad y'all are aware. We have heard this from the low-income housing tax credit community about the taxation issues. I think that's really important. We know that 50% of the purchases are investors. I agree, a local investor that cares about the community and lives in the county has a different perspective and accessibility maybe than national. Good investors can rent quality products, but those homes, if they're owned by a national investor, are lost to home ownership over time because they will trade them to another investor. Smaller investors, when it comes time, well, if they can sell it for more for home ownership, they will. They can sell it more for renter, they might. But if you have a big portfolio, you're trading a portfolio. So we are trying to raise the amount of homes we buy today for rental. Those homes appreciate in value. We can keep them affordable rental because we'll have a low valuation, or we could take some of that increase in value and turn it into a down payment and convert it to home ownership tomorrow. So we're hopeful of doing more work in DeKalb and elsewhere in rental. Let's go to the recommendations. One of the things on local funding, there is a mechanism in Georgia for local governments to do a housing bond. It's often done in partnership with the housing authority, but backed by the GO of the local government. The city of Atlanta has done this, and there's great flexibility. You could use it to help LIHTC projects, to help down payment, to help single family development. Y'all ought to take a look at that. CDBG can be a source. Some are looking at how do you fast track, more accessible, affordable programs through a permitting program, because since COVID, those are hard everywhere. Y'all are already looking at ARPA funds. Actually, home ownership and single family rental is a quick way to deploy because the lead time to buy an existing home, give it a little bit of love and rent it where it's accessible, it isn't that long. And I'll add philanthropy. There have been studies about philanthropy and how it flows through cities versus other areas. There is an effort at the Community Foundation that is called House ATL. It started to serve the city of Atlanta. It's about collaborating on housing. There's efforts to bring in funders, both low cost debt funders, maybe impact funders, but also charitable grant givers. And that group is now talking, has sent signals that it is going metro. I think DeKalb County ought to raise its hand and say, we have an affordable housing issue. We have a proven track record of great players. You've got an amazing housing authority. You've got some not-for-profits, us and Habitat and others that are doing good work. We can be a good steward of charitable dollars. ANDP in its current efforts is leveraging charitable dollars 25 to 1. That track record for us is often in DeKalb County. Let's make that case so that we can get philanthropic support into this as well. As you look at the levers, national government, local government, doing more locally with your dollars and your programs, the boards that you appoint, and your great housing authority. And I like to think some of the not-for-profit partners like us, we are not alone, that you've helped to develop through your home and NSP programs. I will yield there. I know y'all have had a busy agenda. Look forward to working with you as we do more to figure this out.
Go back to your slide one. I got to see 1, 2, or 3, and I'm gonna make a comment on that because I want people to see that DeKalb has not been just sitting back waiting on stuff to happen. We've been doing things to impact housing for years.
You want the Home South DeKalb?
Yeah, this one right here, the
Yeah.
plan. No, stay with the plan right quick. And I want people, no, was the one with the plan is another, keep going up.
There's one with our results that just
Yes.
followed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I want to see. I like the
So-
results.
Yeah, so that was key. We had roots. We were talking to charitable donors about doing something in a suburban community. And because we had local connections, there are many of you on this call that ANDP has known for our 31-year history. Commissioner Lauren Johnson or Cochran Johnson had been in a consulting position with another charitable funder and had actually done a convening where we walked in DeKalb County and said, you know, if I walked into that room in Atlanta, the housing authority, we knew players there, but some of the other not-for-profits, we didn't know. And I was like, shame on ANDP. We need to put down some roots and make some connections. Talk to members of the Board of Commissioner, CEO's office was key, was able to go back to the funder and say, we think we have a good partner in DeKalb. And that charitable dollars we raised from a variety of funders, it was hard work, 1.2 million, but we're now able to show them we leveraged that with some support from the local government, sure, but from other federal and highly competitive sources, and developed 100 homes and altogether invested over 20 million. So that leverage, I think, is very important. You know, Commissioner Rader had a question, well, what is more expensive? Sort of depends, right? But you want to leverage local dollars and resources to get the most impact.
Thank you.
We appreciate DeKalb in helping us to prove it. Some other suburban areas are asking us to do more there. We're going to continue to serve DeKalb, but it's, you know, there are needs throughout the region.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. And I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure we highlight the work that's been done and what can happen when you build partnerships like this with organizations and nonprofits like that you are. So we appreciate that. And you and Mr. Walker, are there any questions for ANDP before I go to our next topics? All right, Commissioner Ted Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really excited to hear that the cottage project in Decatur is moving forward. And as Mr. O'Callaghan pointed out, the land trust was vital in securing that development because they didn't have to buy the land. As was mentioned in the housing study, one of the recommendations is to create a DeKalb land trust. And so I think we should do that. The Home South program is amazing. The more I've learned about it, the more I keep asking, when's phase 2? When are we going to do more? Because clearly it has been impactful, and it's been, again, one of the multitude of tools in the toolbox that we can employ. And I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Chair, because everything that I'm saying here in this committee meeting is not saying that DeKalb is not doing anything. But what we have been presented with here today is, I think, pretty overwhelming evidence that we are doing a lot, but we could also do a lot more. And there's just, there's that old saying, don't rest on your laurels. And one crisis to the next, 1 year to the next. It's great. We can celebrate the victories. We can reflect on what we've done. But we got to keep it moving. We got to keep things moving forward. And I just really, I don't understand the sentiment when we are being told by experts, by advocates, by policymakers, by people who understand these issues inside and out, and are literally telling us that we have the power to make these changes ourselves right now. And then we question whether we do have the power. Because when I look at our NACO partners and what's happening in those counties around the country, I see county commissioners in those counties telling their constituents, making promises to their constituents that they're going to do something on housing, and they're doing it. And so at the end of the day, we have the power to do something about it. And we can choose to act, or we can choose to rest on our laurels. And put me in the camp of continuing to push forward progress on this issue, because it impacts every aspect of our community. And it's not saying what in the past wasn't good enough. I don't understand why. It's a general statement on politicians. People are too thin-skinned, too egotistical. They get too concerned about criticism. I don't personally criticize anyone. I consider ourselves to be professionals and to be public servants. And so everything that I say is in the interest of the public I serve. It's not to try to win political points or to try to, downgrade anyone else's accomplishments. It's just to say that what I'm seeing is that the solutions we put forward are really good, but they're not enough. And so we continue to push forward.
Right. I think that's not the issue. I think the tone and tenor and the message we're trying to convey is we're just listening different into this conversation. And I just don't want it. That's why I got to keep reiterating that nobody here wants to see us do nothing. And we've been doing stuff and we continue to do stuff. I don't think you can have an Alan Mitchell who works on housing each and every day. And he has stories, if I let him, give him a chance to tell it. We're doing stuff in housing all the time. The information that Mr. O'Callahan talked about, those folks are now in homes. That's going to be sustainable for generations. That's wealth. That's their family. So part of what we're saying is that DeKalb has shown and not continue to relent on what we are capable of doing, but it takes a collaboration and partnerships. We can't leave here saying that DeKalb going to be all and end all. We have to work with partners. I'm the former president of NACO. I believe in partnerships and collaboration. Anybody, any commissioner you talk to across the country will tell you that their county did not do it by themselves. They had to work with federal, state, nonprofits, and all these different entities to make housing a reality for their county. And see, in different counties may have housing where DeKalb, that's not under our authority. And so we work with our partners to make the best that we can do. And so all of us in our own little connections or office, we all are pushing for the same, I think, action to be done. Nobody wants to leave a citizen without a house or be homeless. Housing is a right. And I said that on your webinar, and I appreciate what you did in bringing that forward. So we all go in the same boat. So nobody has to push me to be in housing. I'm already doing it and going to want to do more. So I don't need an extra push to doing something that I know is the right thing to do. And if you came from those environments where you've been discriminated against and you had to deal with discrimination, I don't need somebody to tell me what it takes and not getting the right house or not having a home loan because they discriminate against you because of your color, not getting in certain neighborhoods because of your color. So I don't that's the part that I don't need to have be pushed on, because I understand discrimination. I understand how it works. I've been a person who's been discriminated against, and I know how much it takes for us to get people in housing. My family's been evicted, and we lost the house, and I know what it did for our family after we lost the house. So I'm not talking from textbook, or not talking from not being through it. We've been through that, and so I'm glad I'm at a point being a commissioner where I can help and assist more people to not go through what I've been through, or to stop them from feeling any sting without having a house. So Commissioner Marita Davis Johnson, then I'm going to have our staff come on to tell us about what our next steps will be at our next meeting. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that you covered pretty much what I've covered, because I understand the challenges of housing with poor folk, and not only poor folk, but poor Black folk, which are more so discriminated against. So I think that you pretty much have conveyed what I wanted to say, but this is an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing issue, and it's going to take all of us to come to a resolution on it. But you, as I, understand it firsthand, not only from my personal experiences, but from my families and our friends that have had similar experiences. So, you know, this is something that I know that you're committed to, and I know that I'm committed to, and I'm assuming the rest of the commissioners are too. And so it's not a thing of power, ego, or showing what's what. It's a matter of, it's just the right thing to do to try to get people in housing. And that's what we will continue to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our speakers. This is a first step to set the foundation around framing the housing conversation. And I want to hear from Mr. Marcus Allen on what we have lined up for our next committee meeting, special call meeting.
Yes, sir. Our next special called PECS committee meeting on housing is scheduled for Thursday, September 8th at 10 a.m. And at that time, just as we've done today, it'll be even more comprehensive discussion from, first of all, the federal and state partnerships that can be done, and the role on housing that can be addressed from several partners such as NACO, ACCG, Georgia State University as well. And the second half of the meeting will be focused on local policies regarding housing from agencies and partners such as the Housing Authority, the Lithonia Housing Authority, and the City of Atlanta's Housing Authority. So a very robust discussion on the local, state, federal levels.
Thank you. And I brought that up because we need to work in partnership with our cities as we move forward, who has an authority, housing authorities, and then we can see what our plans will be overall. You cannot just create a DeKalb County plan without having to work with our cities. And so this committee, and when we're dealing with housing, will be done methodically. We'll be diligent in our work, and then we will come back with recommendations. Dr. Rich is not the only, his study is not the only recommendations we may have to look at. But I want to make sure when we get to the end, we have vetted this, we have educated people in our community on what housing is and how we do it. And this is how we will proceed. And so this committee, Planning, Economic, and Community Services, will then look at these recommendations. And then we will vote on what we can take forward and bring it to the full body and ask what we can do, working with our CEO, working with our state and federal, and move forward. And we have no bad recommendations so far. All of these have been on point, been on the money, and they can help our people in our community. So I'm excited about it. But before I go, is the law department on here? Is Mr. Phillips or Miss Ernst? And I wanted
Yes,
you,
sir.
you remember what I asked you last week about our role based on the organizational act. I meant to do this at the beginning. Can you talk to us about what the county role is in the state in DeKalb and how the counties operate in Georgia around housing?
Yes, sir. And I think a lot of the speakers today have touched on the variety of roles that various stakeholders have. The Organizational Act, generally, sir, does not address housing directly. There are some provisions of state law which put significant limits on what a county can and cannot do. So, for example, a county has no authority to cap rent. That is not an authority that is left to the county. A county has no authority to create any sort of registration of rental properties. A lot of discussion occurred today during committee meeting about investor homes and trying to determine that which is a large investment group, or that which is, like Commissioner Bradshaw, what did y'all call him, the mom and pop landlord. But there is no ability currently under Georgia law for counties to create any sort of registries of rental properties. And I think that is something that, as commissioners, you all are talking about your legislative agenda. It was mentioned today about that. In each county in Georgia, there is a housing authority. Mr. Walker is the embodiment of the housing authority. It is run by a separately appointed board. It has specific statutory duties with respect to housing and get specific funding from the state and in some instances from the county. So generally, there are also a number of federal laws, as you all are all well aware of, that deal with housing and low-income housing and subsidies and all kinds of available grants and funds that are available to counties. So there is a limited role both in zoning, but also in terms of what your zoning ordinances look like. And Commissioner Larry Johnson, you're right on point. You've been talking about affordable housing and workforce housing ordinances and working on that kind of an issue for a number of years to ensure that it's the right fit for DeKalb. But there is that provision which deals with housing. But generally, that is the sort of the lay of the land in a 30,000 foot view, Commissioner.
And thank you. And the organizational act is what? What is that?
So in DeKalb
like the
County, I
Constitution?
apologize, sir. I should have explained that at the beginning. In 1978, the Constitution of Georgia was amended to allow for an executive and legislative branch of government in DeKalb County. As a result of that constitutional amendment in 1981, the voters approved and the General Assembly enacted and the voters approved an organizational act. And a lot of people, we call it the charter. It is the document enacted by the General Assembly that sets forth the duties and responsibilities of the legislative branch, that being the Board of Commissioners, and the executive branch, that being the Chief Executive Officer. And it has been amended a number of times since 1981 and remains the document that governs how the county performs its duties and where the authority lies within the county.
All right, thank you. And I should have had you at the beginning, but I just thought about it. But that was what we talked about, that I do my homework as the chair. I read, I get information before I come to this meeting. But I'm also the type of chair, I don't want us to just go off and create resolutions and ordinances that we can get sued on, because it's going to cost taxpayer money. And if you know you're going to lose, you lose those things alone, because you got to be in line with the state and federal government. So what we come out of here with is ordinances and resolutions and recommendations that we can go take to help our citizens around housing to make things happen. And so I wanted to give us, this has been an educational meeting around housing. And I appreciate Commissioner Rader, he had to leave, and Commissioner Marita Davis Johnson. And we will see you all for the special call meeting on housing conversation and framing our housing discussion on September 8th at 10 a.m. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we appreciate you all participating. Thank you. Bye-bye.